Hello and welcome to the channel, my friends. It's Thunderbob here, and tonight we are going to talk about a franchise that is very close to my heart. Resident Evil. This is a series that has basically been there from my earliest gaming days. A series that has grown with me over the years, reinventing itself with each new release and with each new generation. Of all of the game series I have enjoyed over the decades, Resident Evil has the most impressive release cadence, while also maintaining a very high level of quality, with just a few missteps over the years. I've been playing these games at release for nearly 30 years now, but I've come to realize that while I've replayed a few of the games many times, like Resident Evil 4, there are a few that I've not played since that original release date many years ago, and there are at least 2 mainline games that I never actually completed. So my plan is to replay every mainline release in the series, including all of the numbered titles and the remakes. And I'm going to throw in Code Veronica and Revelations 1 and 2, even though it's debatable if those are mainline games. I'm going to play through the games in release order, and then put together a review and retrospective for each game individually. I intend to contrast my memories and feelings playing these games originally years and decades ago against how the games hold up today. I'm going to play through these games on the PC where available, and for the older titles with graphical mods to try to play these in the best possible light today. When I'm done with the entire series, I want to do a final video with my overall thoughts on the series and a ranking of all of the games. And a warning here, there will be some spoilers, but let's go ahead and get started. And tonight we're going to be talking about the original Resident Evil. The original Resident Evil was released in April of 1996 in the US, though I didn't get to play it for at least a year after that. To start with, we should probably put into context how and when I played that original Resident Evil. So, I grew up with a hand-me-down NES in the early 90s, but I really got into gaming when I received a Super Nintendo for the Christmas of about 1993. Mario, Donkey Kong, Zelda, Metroid, NES. These were the characters that introduced me to gaming. Not long after the next generation started, I begged my parents for a new console. Around Christmas of 96 or 97, it's a little bit hazy, they finally relented, and they asked me what I wanted, a PlayStation or a Nintendo 64. Do you remember how you could rent consoles back in the day? So, my parents actually let me rent a PlayStation one weekend and a Nintendo 64 a different weekend, and I rented Resident Evil among a few other titles. To say that I was amazed by Resident Evil would be an understatement. I have these vivid memories of the game. My dad was behind me watching me from the recliner reading his newspaper. He wasn't much of a gamer, but he would sometimes help me if I was stuck or comment on the game I was playing. Resident Evil was one of the first times I can remember him actually being interested in the game I was playing. Between the live-action footage, the more cinematic experience, and just how scary it all seemed, he actually became pretty involved. So in my memories, I remember walking through this mansion, avoiding zombies, with my dad at my side. I lost both of my parents a couple years ago, but it's nice to return to memories like this. And I think it's one of the reasons I've been returning to these older games from my youth. I'm chasing that nostalgic feeling of my dad sitting behind me on the couch, feigning interest and commenting on the game I'm playing. Now, I'm pretty sure I beat the game that weekend I rented it, but the only way that was possible is because the rental company was nice enough to provide a hand-printed guide with item locations and tips. Otherwise, I don't think my not quite teenage years would have any way to beat this. So in my memory, the game looks so real. The characters are so alive and vivid. The story is so gripping. This was my first exposure to the next generation of consoles. And if you grew up at this time, this was a pretty huge advancement. We went from 2D games to 3D games. I had never really experienced anything like this before. Now let's jump ahead 30 years into the future. I'm playing on a modded copy of the PC version of the game with HD textures, and this is basically the most optimized and best looking of the version you can play today. While some of the artwork still holds up, overall the graphics are quite archaic, even with these mods. However, I think the thing that most holds up is the atmosphere. I think that's why I remember physically walking through the mansion like it was a dream or something. This game has such a foreboding, isolating atmosphere. Except for a few moments, you're on your own in this mysterious mansion. You're left to your own devices to figure out what's happening and how to escape. The music and sound design also adds a ton to this element, and it's something that the series has maintained into the future games. The voice acting and characters are pretty bad, looking back on this game, but at the time it seemed pretty revolutionary, just hearing these characters' voices. Some of these lines are so bad that they've become iconic.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
While the later games in the series maintained a certain level of cheese, I'm looking at you, giant statue of Salazar in Resident Evil 4. The first game has more of an unintentional cheese factor, rather than the intentional cheese of the later titles. Alright, let's take a couple of minutes and talk about the structure of this game. You start out by either picking Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, and with each playthrough being a little bit different, you're a member of the S.T.A.R.S elite response squad of the Raccoon City Police Department. You're dispatched to investigate the Arklay forest and a series of cannibalistic murders that have been discovered. Soon you're attacked by these monstrous dogs and you flee into the mansion. The mansion is an amazing setting, and this opening is such an iconic moment in gaming. You start out really weak with just a pistol, and you often need to avoid enemies rather than taking them on. You explore 2 levels of the mansion, weaving from one end to the other, getting lost, solving puzzles, finding so many goddamn keys, placing gems and moving boxes. You even fight a giant snake. And you progress into the courtyard, and there's some puzzles involving raising, lowering of water. Then you reach the guardhouse, and you avoid some bees and spiders. You fight a giant plant, and for some reason there are sharks here? What the hell is that about? Then you briefly return to the mansion, and you have a rematch with that snake before you head underground. Somewhere in here, the zombies are replaced by hunters that are a bit more aggressive, but they still go down pretty easy, because at this point in the game, you've got a lot more firepower. You make your way through the underground tunnels until you end up in the Umbrella secret labs, and you discover Wesker was the traitor the whole time. Who would have thought? It's the guy who wears his sunglasses all the time. You fight the tyrant, and you get a chance to rescue the other playable character. Along the way, you may have discovered the fate of some of the other S.T.A.R.S members, and even helped some of them. And depending on the choices you made along the way and which characters you're playing as, it can subtly change the ending. Each location is well designed and adds something, but personally the mansion is a favorite of mine. It's the most real location, with such a smart layout that slowly unfolds and expands as you explore like a little puzzle box. Let's talk puzzles, by the way. The puzzles here can be frustrating at times, but not necessarily because they're hard. More because they're artificially complicated by the limited inventory. You get 6 spots playing as Chris and 8 for Jill, and Jill almost feels like an easy mode in the original game. The problem is that everything requires an inventory slot. Weapons, ammo, keys, the ink to save your game, and other story-related items. An example of an annoying puzzle comes to mind. You come to this room where you need to move a pillar to the middle of the room using a crank. I solved this puzzle rather quickly, but I realized that I had no inventory slots to pick up the item. So I went back to the box and dropped off the crank and returned, only to realize that the puzzle room resets when you leave, and I needed the crank again. So I ran all the way back to the box again. This time I had to pick up the crank and make another spot in my inventory free, and then return to the puzzle again, finally pick up the item so I can progress the story. This is exacerbated in some areas, as you want to avoid zombies and enemies at times, so you'll leave some alive, but now you're running back and forth from the item box to the puzzle location, avoiding enemies. Sometimes these safety rooms, the item boxes, are not in the most useful spots either. Later games in the series solved the inventory problem in different ways. Sometimes they would have a separate inventory for keys and other story-related items. and in some games it was just larger inventories. I'm fine with the inventory Tetris for your survival tools, but it could be annoying when you're juggling so many key items and it forces a lot of unnecessary backtracking. Now let's get to the elephant in the room. Tank controls. The controls of these early Resident Evil games have received some hate for being stiff and unwieldy and difficult. Now there are two reasons in my mind why the game has tank controls. First off, you're given limited movement during combat because this is not an action game, but rather a horror game. Later games provided more mobility and tools, and started to become a bit more actiony than the original trilogy, which is really largely straight horror. You're meant to feel weak and vulnerable, and a single misstep can mean death. The other reason is these games have fixed camera angles, because the backgrounds are essentially detailed 2D backdrops. The characters and enemies are pixels drawn over the top of these backdrops. Your character controls like a tank, so that up always moves you forward, so as the camera shifts, you continue to hold that button and maintain momentum. It takes some time to adjust, but after a few minutes, it becomes pretty easy. So, final thoughts. We've talked about the graphics, the sound, we've walked through the story, the puzzles, the gameplay. Let's get to my final thoughts. Resident Evil is a special game to me because of the memories I have playing it with my dad. It returns me to a simpler time that I yearn for today, and I find it so hard to recapture. This game feels a bit like a prototype for the later games in the series, as it introduced nearly every mechanic that the series still relies on to this day, but almost every one of those aspects, except perhaps the atmosphere, has been improved upon and expanded in the later titles. Is Resident Evil worth playing today? Overall, it still holds up pretty well, but I could see the need for a remaster. Not another remake, but take this original game and actually make it a little bit more playable today. I'm playing with a heavily modded version that improves the graphics and adds a few small quality of life improvements, and I fear that it may still be pretty inaccessible for new players to the series. And this is perhaps the only game in the series that I feel like the remake is simply a better version and largely replaces the need for the original game. They're similar enough in setting, tone, control, that you may be better served simply starting with the remake if you want to play the series rather than picking up the original. However, if you want to see where the series began, or if you played this as a child and you want to revisit the series, it is still totally playable today, and I would recommend checking it out still. Well, thank you for watching, everybody. If you enjoyed this, please do like, subscribe, drop a comment with any thoughts, and keep an eye out for future reviews as I will be going through the entire series over the next couple of months.